Okay, so part two of this video is going to address the stereotype or controlling image of the welfare queen, particularly centering the black female experience. So the idea of the welfare queen, like a lot of stereotypes, goes back to slavery. So if you're not comfortable with that, I'm sorry, but that's the reality that we live. So keeping that in mind, going back to slavery, it was extremely imperative that for the white slave owners, when they were getting pressured to they were getting pressured to abolish slavery, and so when that finally took place, it was really imperative for white society to perpetuate the notion that black people were inherently lazy, as that would serve as a justification for not allowing them access to education, jobs, etc. Things that are really important for people in any society, but in particular at this time, that served, or the creation of the idea of that black people are lazy comes from an attempt to erase black labor and all of our work and everything that we put into founding this nation. It serves to erase that from the white American consciousness, but eventually, post-slavery, it also served to reinforce Jim Crow laws that, even though may not necessarily have been legal, assumptions that black people were lazy was an excuse or justification as to why one shouldn't hire black people, and also as a justification for why they were deviant and why they should be continuously segregated from white society in the U.S., despite the obvious notion that, or the obvious idea that, fact really, that black people didn't come here intentionally for the most part. And so the idea of that black people are lazy, I mean, that's a stereotype overall. That idea comes from a purposeful attempt by white America to erase the black labor from American consciousness. And so with that, we come to today, where that stereotype has been perpetuated essentially since the abolishment of slavery all throughout the country, particularly in the South, obviously. And so that idea comes into play when we talk about the welfare queen, because the essential premise of the welfare queen idea is that she's exploiting the system. She's purposefully and manipulating the system to get what she needs or get whatever she wants out of it. And the welfare queen is obviously a racialized term. Most of us are well aware that when you talk about a welfare queen, the first idea that pops in your head is a black woman, perhaps with a colorful weave or a coach bag on her arm that's toting a bunch of babies. Maybe she's pregnant. Those are some of the stereotypical images that pop up if you Google welfare queen. And so in deconstructing that notion, it's really important to recognize that that has a legacy coming from slavery, essentially, and how those notions of that were purposefully put in place post-slavery, especially during Jim Crow, have impacted policymakers today to genuinely believe that black people don't work hard, black people are lazy, black people are only out to exploit the system and get what they want, black people are only capable of doing things when they have government assistance or affirmative action in place, despite what we know about the fact that white women benefit most from affirmative action in the employment industry. And so with all that in mind, the idea of the welfare queen is a direct erasure of the history of the work and effort and blood, sweat, tears, and essentially erasure of all of our people that died during slavery and all the work and effort put into maintaining that. And it also helps to create this notion or reinforce this notion that black women aren't capable or good mothers, which also in some ways comes from slavery, because we Black women at the time were forced to watch as their children were taken from their breasts, sometimes immediately after giving birth, and sold off to other families or states sometimes. And, you know, that creates a kind of important relationship to recognize of how Black women's suffering, in particular around our children and our sense of motherhood, and which oftentimes leads people to forms of self-actualization, how that plays into today and the idea of the welfare mother, as if, you know, needing public assistance makes you automatically deviant, especially if you're a Black woman. You know, there's been a few documentaries and writings on, you know, the welfare surveillance and how hyper surveillance of Black women, but people just in general, welfare receivers in like the 80s and 90s, how those increased surveillance practices serve to keep those people in a position of subordination. And so the assumption that, you know, a single Black mother is unable to provide for her children ultimately erases, you know, all of the hard work that mothers, Black mothers, have done to provide for their children, and all of the struggles that we've had to go through in that process. And in doing so, it kind of ignores all the class implications, the race implications, the gendered implications, and also just like intersectionality as a whole. It really serves to denigrate our experiences and invalidate the knowledge that we produce from said experiences that isn't necessarily valued in white-dominated spaces like academia. And so it's really important, as we're going through this Herstory, to discuss how it is that slavery and the purposeful notion of Black laziness serves to maintain a hierarchy of under the assumption that white people work hard, Black people do not, and also serves to reinforce the white-Black dichotomy as well as the us-them dichotomy. And it also serves to maintain the Black identity, in particular the Black female identity, as deviant in this society, which obviously has a lot of implications to think about. And so just like judgment in general, that kind of judgment is a lot of the reason why Congress and the Senate choose to pass policies that often negatively affect Black women through state-sanctioned violence, even though a lot of their assumptions about these women are premised on these controlling images, on these stereotypes, versus actually living their experiences or ever even interacting with a Black woman who's struggling in a poor, low-income, predominantly Black neighborhood. And so just for those of you who tend to lean that way and that kind of thinking, I just invite you to kind of look at this history of how these images have negatively impacted Black women and what we can do to help dismantle that, because at the end of the day, Black people our labor was the primary foundations of this country, and for us to be continually deviated and othered and told that we are not good enough or that we don't work hard is just a complete erasure of our entire history here in the United States, and our entire role in helping found this capitalistic, imperialist nation that we live in.